What do we need in violent times? Stronger weapons systems, better intelligence so that we can root out threats before they arise, a more robust police force, or rules for governing its use? Well, Emily Katz Anhalt, who teaches classical languages and literature at Sarah Lawrence College, believes we need stories, and not just any stories, ancient Greek myths.
These are not stories about us directly, right? We don't star in these tales. So we can be moved by the characters' predicaments and what happens to them, but we're not blinded by rage.
We'll be talking with Professor Anhalt about her book, Enraged, Why Violent Times Need Ancient Greek Myths, published in 2017 by Yale University Press. How do ancient Greek myths teach us the consequences of rage, especially in society? What do they tell us about how to remove ourselves from feelings and situations of rage, or how to channel rage more productively? And how can they help us to empathize with those whom we see as our opponents, those who perhaps stoke our rage? I'm Matthew Wickman, founding director of the BYU Humanities Center and host of this podcast. And now our conversation with Emily Katz Anhalt. Emily Katz Anhalt, it is a pleasure to have you here as the inaugural guest of our BYU Humanities Center podcast. You published this book, this really fascinating book, in 2017 with Yale University Press, and I just discovered the book this year in 2020. The book seems, if anything, more relevant 3 years later. I wonder if you could tell us how you came upon the idea for this project. Was it in thinking about, these violent times of ours, or was it thinking about ancient Greek myth and its applicability to all times and eras?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm very happy to have this opportunity. Yeah, as a classicist, I always want my work to be relevant, but somehow not quite so much, I think. To be honest, the Enraged is the first piece of a project that I actually started thinking about in 2011 during the so-called Arab Spring. Oh, right. And I was very surprised to hear people confidently expecting that democratic institutions would just simply magically arise in places that had only ever known dictatorship. And I found myself thinking, you probably wouldn't think that if you had ever read the Iliad or the Odyssey. So I wanted to write a book for people who were concerned about current events, but maybe unaware of the valuable assistance available to us in the form of ancient Greek epics and tragedies.
That's really that's really interesting that it was born in 2011 in some way, this project. Historically, so you study classical languages and literature. Are you somebody who's always thought about the connection between what you've studied and the world in which you're living, or is it the kind of thing where that came upon you? Because a lot of academics, we get so down the rabbit hole of our specialization. We're talking to other academics. It's a different thing to do what you're doing and to talk about your specialty to a much broader reading public.
Well, in college and graduate school, I was taught to read with one eye on the text and one eye on the world. So I think I've always been interested in the intersections between literature and politics. That is, how our stories shape our attitudes and aspirations, how they cultivate our interactions with one another, how we treat one another, how we expect to be treated. And I think our literature routinely does this for us. One of the remarkable things about ancient Greek epics and tragedies to me is that these were not and are not just entertainment. They actively invite our critical judgment. So they don't shape us unconsciously. They invite us to interact and to think about the themes and issues that they raise.
Which is a really important point. I'm going to come back to that point in a little while because it's such an important part of your book. And very convincingly, I think, argued in your book. I want to come back and have you elaborate on that a little bit for us later. First off, Ancient Greek myths, there are so many of these, and they're so vivid. And I remember reading about them. We all did when we were children, but they've got so much depth and richness. You're focusing in this book on myths surrounding the Trojan War, right? The Iliad, and things that are related to the Iliad. I wonder why you focus on that particular story, and could you rehearse very briefly that story for those listeners who may have forgotten about it?
Well, I'm embarrassed to admit that it took me a very long time to settle on these three texts for this book, because in retrospect, the choice seems completely obvious. The very first word of the Iliad is the noun rage. And Greek can do this because Greek can start a sentence with the direct object. That doesn't work very well in English. But the major theme of the Iliad is the causes and consequences of one man's rage. Just to sort of recap the Iliad, we see a man become violently angry at an insult. His anger at that point ultimately costs him the death of his very best friend. At that point, he turns his attention, his rage, on a new object, the killer of his friend. And we actually see him become monstrous as he seeks to exact vengeance, and he slaughters indiscriminately. He becomes supernatural in his ability to kill. He kills his friend's killer, and it doesn't help a bit. Right. It doesn't make him feel any better. It doesn't enable him to continue his life. He continues to rage. And what we see in the epic is the one thing that does make him feel better and able to regain his humanity is his ability to empathize ultimately with his dead enemy's father, and to have this flash of insight where he suddenly realizes what is the one thing we all share as human beings. That is our vulnerability to suffering and death. And that ultimately enables him to regain his humanity and go on living.
That's great. That's great. Some of the characters in this great story, the Iliad, that you talk about in the book, Achilles and Agamemnon and Odysseus and Paris, and there are a number of Hecuba. In fact, the texts that you mentioned three texts in your book. The Iliad takes up about 4 chapters worth, I think. Then there's a chapter devoted to the Ajax, the play by Sophocles, and the Hecuba by the playwright Euripides. There's some very provocative titles to these chapters. I wonder if we could just unpack a few of them here.
Sure.
The first one, chapter 1, is titled Passions and Priorities. What does that chapter kind of reconstruct for us?
So this is one of the oddities of the Iliad is that it depicts a 10-year conflict, but it starts in the middle of the 10th year. So this is a war that's been going on for 10 years, and suddenly we're swept up into the very middle of the conflict in the 10th year. And what we see is not Trojans battling Greeks or Greeks battling Trojans. In book 1 of the Iliad, you see the leader of the Greeks arbitrarily opt to take a prize from his best warrior. And the warrior reacts with incredible rage, that's Achilles, and decides to withdraw from the fighting, and requests, in fact, that the gods bring death and destruction on his own team, his own people, the Greeks. And so what we see in the opening scenes of the Iliad is you see powerful men with hot tempers who are more concerned about their own honor than they are about the quality of life or the survival even of the people who choose to honor them. So the Iliad at the very beginning introduces this, what I see as a very political question, that is, what do we choose to honor and admire in our leading figures? We are going to be susceptible to the consequences of their decisions. And we need to think long and hard about the qualities that we seek in them, that we choose to admire.
Yeah, great. It's interesting that problem. These days, one hears or thinks about that kind of problem with Achilles, who feels dishonored and therefore wishes to bring down hurt or does not care about the hurt to his own people. You think about the slogans like, party over country and this kind of thing. That there's a version of that kind of rage or collective embitterment. Another chapter in here where you start to unpack this even further is the next chapter called Them and Us.
Yeah.
What does that chapter address?
Well, one of the fundamental features of archaic society and the world that Homer depicts is this division of the world into friends and enemies, friends and foe. And that, of course, is also the fundamental distinction in fascist ideals and also totalitarian ideals. There's us and them. And so for me, one of the remarkable things about the Iliad is that it's not a tale of this glorious Greek victory. The Greeks, we know, did succeed in destroying Troy, but the Iliad doesn't even show that. And it doesn't show you the conflict purely from the Greeks' perspective. The audience has a much broader perspective than the characters in the tale have. And one of the things that we see is life inside the Trojan city, what the Trojans are experiencing in this siege. So the Iliad completely humanizes the Greeks' mortal enemies, but shows that they are people just like the Greeks. They share the same religious beliefs. They share the same they have family that love them. So the narrative doesn't demonize the Greeks' opponents. It encourages the audience to see every human participant as fully mortal and valuable as an individual, as a human being.
That's such a great and important point. There are so many passages in this book that I love. That chapter there that you just were talking about has a passage here I want to quote. It's page 41. And you write that this chapter, I'm going to quote here from your book, makes suddenly visible to the audience amid the chaos and carnage of a catastrophic conflict, the alternative to raging bloodlust, namely conversation, rational thought, and the decision to honor a moral obligation. Conversation should be so easy. We're having one this morning, for example, the two of us. It's very pleasant. And yet, the Iliad portrays conversation as being potentially so difficult. And this really struck me as resonant with our polarized society at present. Why do you think, do you see that difficulty of conversation portrayed in the Iliad, or does it actually find ways to break down that difficulty, not just for us as readers, but for the characters in the story?
Well, another fascinating thing about the Iliad, this is a culture that the warriors within the epic value martial success, that is, the ability to defeat your enemy in warfare. But at the same time, they recognize that high achievers need to be doers of deeds and speakers of words. So they do value the ability to speak persuasively. And the passage that you just read follows on the heels of my description of this really extraordinary conversation that occurs between a Greek warrior and a Trojan warrior right in the heat of battle. It's entirely implausible, but it does definitely draw your attention because it is so implausible. And these two guys, before they start throwing their spears at one another, one of them says to the other one, "Who are you?" And they have this exchange, and they suddenly realize that their ancestors, their great-great-grandfathers, were what the Greeks understood as guest friends. The Greeks had a very complex system governing the moral behavior between guests and hosts, the obligations you had as a guest or as a host. So these guys realized that since their grandfathers or great-great-grandfathers were guest friends, then they must be too, because it's an inherited obligation. But the key here is that they choose to honor it. And they only discover that they have this connection because they talk to each other. So what the audience sees is that the decision to honor a moral obligation is a choice, and it comes as the product of conversation and rational thought. So these two warriors end up exchanging armor, and they part as friends. and they go off and kill other people, but not
That's
each
right, not
other.
each other. Yeah, important distinction in the Iliad, and
Yes,
in the present, I've got to say too.
yes.
Um,
They don't become peaceniks by any means.
that's right. That's right. No, no, that's going a step too far, right? So,
Right, right. It's just a
um,
glimpse. It's just a glimpse of what's
yeah,
possible.
but an important one. You say something else in that chapter I find really important. It says on page 49. You write that human communities can derive greatest benefit from, but are also most vulnerable to, their most talented and exceptional members. The quarrel between Achilles, right, the great warrior, and Agamemnon, the king, exposes the need, therefore, for everyone to think very carefully in deciding which human talents and achievements deserve the greatest honor. You continue, which goals should we strive for? Which abilities should we prize in our leaders and cultivate in ourselves? You know, it's such a nice observation, Emily. It really rings true. My question concerns your sense of our degree of agency in making these choices. To what extent are we actually able to deliberate on the virtues that we prize as a society, or to what extent do we find ourselves reacting simply to people who are powerful and more wealthy and more able? How much agency do we have in the values that we determine that we want?
Well, this is a great question. This is a great question. And we do inherit sort of traditional values from our families, from our communities. Uh, the Greeks were constantly interrogating their own traditional values because, of course, the Iliad and the Odyssey were transmitted orally for centuries before they were ever written down. So they kind of evolved as the needs of the community evolved. And then centuries later, the tragedians were plumbing this same traditional material and exposing some of the traditional ideals as problematic in a democratic society. By the time of the tragedians, Athens enjoyed a fully radical democratic society, but its members had inherited these traditional ideals of friend and foe, for example. Uh, so I think we have more agency than we like to admit. It's very easy to cede decision making to our traditional views or to a powerful or authoritative individual. But one of the things that I think both Homeric epics really emphasizes is that there's a more direct correlation between our own choices and the consequences that occur than we often like to admit. The characters within these stories often say, oh, well, God made me do that. But the
Right.
audience sees that that's often not the case at all. It's the character's own poor choices and poor priorities that brought catastrophic results.
That's a great observation again, and certainly very relevant. It seems to me in so many ways for what we are looking at in our present day. There's another chapter in here. Maybe we should have time to go over all of them. I'm going to skip a couple chapters here, and if you want to catch one that we didn't talk
So
about,
that's
you let me know. But when you turn from the Iliad, talking about the Sophocles play, the Ajax, the chapter here is titled "The Dangers." It's very provocative. The dangers of democratic decision making. You know, often we associate danger with the antithesis, right? The loss of any kind of democratic voice or sense of agency. What does that mean in this chapter here? The dangers of democratic decision making.
so, the Greeks were the very first to coin the term and try the experiment. Demokratia is a Greek word. And they recognize the tragedies really expose the fact that a majoritarian decision can promote injustice or even atrocity. In the Hecuba, a democratic decision actually promotes an atrocity. So the Sophocles play, The Ajax, as I read it, exposes this tension between the absolute values of the traditional view, right? There's good and there's bad, there's right and there's wrong. And these things are independent of circumstances. We all know what they are. And then there's the other view that says, well, you can have a majority vote to determine what's right and what's wrong. And what the play shows is that these two ways of determining justice are completely antithetical. So the story in the play is that Ajax, who was the greatest warrior after Achilles died at Troy, he was supposed to get Achilles' armor. and the Greeks voted to give it instead to Odysseus. And everyone in the play accepts that that's a monstrous injustice. And Ajax doesn't take it very well.
Right.
So he's kind of a model for us. It's one of the things that keeps me awake at night is the fear of this election that's coming up in November. No matter what happens, half of the country is going to feel, almost half, is going to feel that it was a monstrous injustice. And what then? How do we react in that situation?
Yeah, I am curious, just putting it a bit mildly. I mean, I think I'm quite fearful, actually, of the outcome of the election, if only because of the likely perception of monstrous injustice and what that may entail. We'll see. I mean, this 2020 has been such an interesting year. I mean, who knows what's next for us? Let me ask you. So you said something here that I find really important, right? So. There are monstrosities kind of on two ends. There, I mean, the monstrosity of, sort of a despotic, tyrannical leader on the one hand. There are also monstrosities of sheer or mere democracy, the popular voice without any sense of moral wisdom. You talk a lot in the book about critical thinking, rational choice, how the Iliad and these other plays allow us to think clearly about the consequences of rage. Do you think that we have the same critical capacity to determine our moral obligations, or are those things, or do we respond to those more than we choose them? I mean, these texts are about choosing our response to situations. Are they equally informative about choosing the moral responsibilities that we have in the first place?
Well, one of the things that I love about the Ajax is that it's even-handed. The play shows us that there's something quite admirable in Ajax, in his determination to remain loyal to his principles, his refusal to change. But the play also shows us that there's something very admirable in the moral flexibility of an Odysseus, who says, I hated him when it was fair to hate. He can't hate his dead enemy after he's dead. And he recognizes the importance of absolute principles of humanity and justice. He fights for the burial of his dead enemy in an effort, under recognizing that he himself will be vulnerable, will be dead one day. So I think that the play shows us that these two ways of determining what is just are in tension with one another, but that they both have value. It is important to have some absolute standards of morality and justice, but at the same time, democratic decision-making requires that we be able to make common cause with political enemies sometimes, and recognize our needs in the needs of others. We have to be able to do both those things. It's very complicated. So I think these plays and these epics actually give us training in the kind of critical reasoning that we need in order to cope with democratic institutions.
I like that very much. It's a great answer, Emily. More on critical reasoning. This is a point your book makes very persuasively, the importance of it and the ways that these epics and myths help us to achieve that kind of critical reasoning. My question here is whether you think that critical reasoning alone is enough. Something else you point out in the book, it's a very good point, that these wonderful stories also moved their audiences. There was an emotional component to them. And I'm curious about how these different parts of these myths interweave, the emotional transport of the story on one side and the cool rationality, the meanings we draw from it on the other. How do these things work together, right? The emotional and the critical.
Well, that's a very interesting question. One of the things that I think is important is that these are not stories about us directly, right? We don't star in these tales. So we can be moved by the characters' predicaments and what happens to them, but we're not blinded by rage. So once you remove rage from the equation, we can feel for these characters. And one of the messages, the supreme message in the Iliad, and I think also in the Ajax, is the importance of empathy, that ability to see our enemy as someone just like us. So I think once you remove rage from the equation, you permit the ability to feel the emotions without turning off your intellectual capacities at the same time.
This is purely anecdotal, but when I was an undergraduate student, I took a drama class, and the teacher actually told us that the easiest emotion to summon of all as an actor is anger or rage. You can do it on the spot. It's very, very simple. And if you want to build a decent character, only go there as a last resort. It's just too easy. And your point here, I mean, sorry to project my own youthful sophomoric experience onto your sophisticated book.
I didn't know that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, but the point is that there need to be various kinds of empathetic engagements, and that's not simply cognitive. It's not simply rational, I should say. It's a more complex cognitive process, empathy is. But that rage is somehow beneath the better aspects of our being in that respect. As a teacher, do you, in teaching myth, is it enough that you feel succeed if you taught critical thinking? I mean, should critical thinking be the preeminent value of a university education, or what is it you try to give your students when you talk with them about these stories?
Well, actually, before I answer that, I wanted to say something about your point about rage, because I do believe that rage, history seems to suggest, is a very natural response to insult and injury and injustice. And the crucial lesson from the Greeks and their myths is to recognize that violent rage doesn't serve you very well, and stop celebrating, admiring the violent rage of other people. It's only at that point that we begin to think clearly. Politicians and leaders who seek to make us very angry, they know what they're doing, because anger distorts our judgment, and it makes us very easy to manipulate. And it makes us easy prey for autocrats. And so the remarkable thing for me is that the Greeks went the other direction. They over centuries, they came to reject tyranny and to experiment with broader forms of political participation. As far as teaching critical thinking as central to a university education, I do think it's a central component. And I think critical thinking, if it's effective, encourages us to empathize with one another as human beings. There's a wonderful line in the Odyssey where Athena says, "Death, you know, is an impartial thing. Not even the gods can ward it off from even someone dear to them when the overwhelming force of prostrating death overcomes him." So we all are mortal. And this is the piece that the Greeks recognized, that our mortality was in fact the spur to our morality. The Greek gods, they can't die. They can't really be injured. They don't need morality. They couldn't use it even if they had it. But because we are mortal, we need morality. And only we can devise it in our interactions with one another, how we treat one another.
Which is great.
And that I think is the crucial piece of a university education.
Yeah, that's really great. It makes the humans in these myths more sophisticated, more complex creatures than the gods, which is a very important point, because humans need to be mortal. They might not be, but they also should be, because there are consequences for them. That their calculus is more complicated than that of the gods in that respect, which is an interesting point to make, I think.
Well, and we come to these stories, I think most of us, or many of us, with that sort of Judeo-Christian conception that the gods are all good, all knowing, and all powerful. And the Greek gods are not.
Right.
The Greek gods just are. They are more like the physical forces of the universe. They provide the constraints within which we have to operate. I mean, I liken Apollo to gravity. You know, gravity doesn't care if you believe in it or not. If you fall out of a 12-story window, you're going to hit the ground hard, whether you believe in gravity or you don't.
Right.
And that's Apollo. So the Greeks just thought, well, we have to operate within these constraints. And the epics and tragedies encourage us to think about the parts of our lives that are in our control, because they have direct causal consequences.
These myths, they have these strapping male characters in them, Achilles and Odysseus and Ajax. But you point out in your book that there's an important place in these myths for women. I'm wondering if you can explain a little what place that is.
Yeah, this is a tough thing because these stories are they emerged in a patriarchal society, uh, even by 21st standards, fully misogynistic society, xenophobic, bellicose, not admirable in many ways. Uh, and so the uncomfortable fact is that women were not considered fully equal to men, and in the epics they are markers, they are possessions, they're markers of male achievement, markers of male status. We only begin in the epics to get a glimpse of female experience and autonomy and agency. So, for example, Helen speaks for herself, the great Helen, who was the catalyst for the Trojan War in the first place. We see more in the Odyssey with Penelope, where she shares nearly all of her husband's great qualities, except for one. She lacks his capacity for emotional restraint. And this was key to the ancient Greek understanding of women. It wasn't that women were less intellectually capable uh, than men. It's that women were less able to control their passions. And the Greeks prided themselves on their ability to control their passions, which is why I don't think it's a coincidence that they're the very first uh, text that has survived in Western civilization addresses the problem of passionate rage, violent rage. But yeah, so women are definitely subordinate, but they often in the tragedies recall men to moral responsibilities that they are forgetting, and that's a key point
A
too.
great point. Thank you. Back to the title of this book, the subtitle. So the title, Enraged, the subtitle, Why Violent Times Need Ancient Greek Myths. I'm wondering if I can ask you a question about that need, about what it is that violent times need from these myths. Do you think that these Greek myths are useful to us, that we need them because they help divert us from rage, or do they teach us instead how to recover from the effects of rage once we recognize the mess we've made of things?
Yeah, I do think we all have a varying capacity for violent rage, but most of us will follow what our culture expects of us. So if we have a culture that's egging us on and saying, yes, get angry, get very angry, the angrier you are, the more sure you can be that you are morally correct, then I think we will lean into our rage. But these epics and tragedies suggest that rage distorts our judgment, that it makes us do things we wouldn't otherwise do, and things we might regret in the morning. And I think in the 21st century, we've developed this very sophisticated technology for killing one another, but we've systematically devalued rational thought, productive conversation, self restraint, qualities that actually would enable us to survive and thrive.
That's a great. I like that a lot. And going back to what you said earlier about the gods, that the Greek gods are more like these forces of nature that give us the constraints in which we have to move. A lot of our technological systems, these forces that we have to hurt each other, are the equivalent of these Greek gods, or these massive forces that create the constraints within which we move. And we have, it seems to me, we're not doing as well as we might as a society, right, in learning the lesson about why it is unwise to act in rage.
Massive understatement there,
Yeah,
Matt.
yeah. Are there times when rage, do you think, is a necessary
Yes,
social response? For example?
yes, I think that anger at times can promote a necessary and constructive response to injustice. But when anger slops over into violence, and we're seeing now the introduction or the reintroduction of violence into the political process, well, then it becomes completely counterproductive. And it prevents us from seeing creative solutions to existential problems that face all of us. Problems like a pandemic or climate change, wildfires, hurricanes. These are indiscriminate moral forces, just like the gods. The gods are indiscriminate moral forces. A pandemic doesn't care which way you vote or if you're a good person or a bad person. And so rage prevents us from seeing our common interests and from thinking creatively about solutions.
I see. And that seems so pertinent in so many ways. The need for creative thinking about how to address some of these problems. That, I mean, some problems, okay, are pretty easy, not easy to solve, but they're easy to see. Others, the way out of them seems much more complex. Requires, I think, all the empathy and critical acuity we can summon. Begins in conversation. I've got just a few more minutes here to ask maybe two more questions. I'm curious. So I find myself in the middle of my career. I'm not brand new on the block as a professor, and you've been teaching for a little while yourself. Do you value myths differently now than you did a decade or two ago? I'm wondering how your appreciation of these myths has evolved from when you were, a graduate student or first starting out in your career versus thinking about them now in terms of these large categories, their large applicability to our modern situations.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, it's been sort of, I think, a gradual evolution for me. I've always sort of walked along with one foot in the ancient world and one foot in ours. More and more, I've realized how important it is for people in specialized disciplines to reach out to broader audiences. We can get so insular, and we're just writing for each other, and that doesn't help anyone. These stories that I'm fascinated by used to be ubiquitous. People knew them well, and certainly in the ancient world, they knew them well. And now they tend to be, oh yeah, I kind of remember that. I read it a little bit in high school. But people are not as familiar with them as I think would be helpful for all of us. One of the things I've noticed more and more with my students is that they come to these stories thinking that they are monolithic, that there's one version of each story because that was the version maybe that they encountered. But in fact, they're constantly evolving. So the oral tales were evolving as they were told and retold. And then the tragedies were changing details and emphases to address the needs of an entirely new political moment. And even now we have modern retellings. So every retelling tells you what the teller cares about and values. I encourage my students to look at modern entertainment, film, television, novels, to see where these stories are still cropping up with transmitting new messages. I don't think I answered your question.
No, you did actually, and you're pointing out that there are different versions of these myths. That's the thing about myth that's so great. It's such flexible. It's a very flexible narrative medium. It accommodates novelty and difference of perspective and application to new situations. So I guess I'll leave you with this question here. It's so as you yourself continue to sort of adapt yourself as a scholar to these myths, what's next for you in your scholarship about them? Do you have a project on the horizon?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked because I have a new book coming out next fall.
Great.
The title at the moment is Defeating Despotism, Why Tyrannical Times Need Ancient Greek Myths. And this is basically the same format. The tales I'm going to be discussing are I discuss it from the Odyssey, from a trilogy of plays by Aeschylus called the Oresteia, and from Sophocles' play The Antigone. And I think these in some sense, were issues that I started with, but I realized that I had to address the very first step for civil society is recognize that violent rage is not in your own best interest. And don't admire it in other people. But that's only a very first step. So this next book addresses, well, what comes next? What other talents, skills, values do you need in order to survive and thrive as an individual, but also to have your community survive and thrive? So that's my next project.
That sounds great. I can't wait to read it. I will mention to our audience, we've had Emily on Zoom. A couple of times the sound got a little bit glitchy, as Zoom always does, but it's been a remarkably good connection. And you are a very engaging guest and scholar. It's been a real delight talking with you, Emily. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for your excellent work. I love the book Enraged. And the next book's title is what at the moment? It's
Defeating Despotism.
Defeating Despotism. Okay, I look forward to that. Yes. Okay, very good.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about Enraged. I would love to come back next time and talk about the new book
That
when
sounds
that comes
great.
out.
We'd love it. All right. Thank you, Emily. Have a wonderful
Thank you.
rest of your day.
Thank you so much. You too. Thanks again, Matt.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the BYU Humanities Center podcast. Think clearly, act well, appreciate life. This podcast is sponsored by the Humanities Center and the College of Humanities of Brigham Young University and is produced and edited by Brooke Brown and Sam Jacob. The music for this podcast is composed by Ethan Wickman and is performed by the Solely Chamber Orchestra and Nicholas Phillips on Albany Records. I'm Matthew Wickman, founding director at the BYU Humanities Center and host of this podcast. If you're interested in other episodes of this podcast or want to know more about the BYU Humanities Center, check out our website at humanitiescenter.byu.edu. Thanks again for listening.